Rediscover America presents The Do for Others Day by Roger Hukle and Elizabeth Hillie, with illustrations by Bob Haynes. Read by Mark Epperson and co-produced with Suzanne Arendt of Crystal Peak Design. Prologue. Imagine, dear reader, life without electricity, running water, phones, televisions, computers, or any of the other conveniences we take for granted today. Imagine having to make your own clothes, grow your own food, and cook over an open fire. Can you envision it? If you can, then you can also imagine what it would have been like to live in the early American colonies. From a very young age, you would have been assigned chores by your parents. On any given day, these might have included taking care of farm animals, helping to harvest crops, getting water from the well, or collecting firewood. You would have probably been able to read, but after primary school, you would have spent most of your time learning a trade or working on the farm. There were a number of advantages enjoyed by young people back in those days. For example, you weren't required to take a bath very often, and eating with your fingers was considered good manners. Many children also shared wooden plates, so you may have had to finger fight with your brother or sister for your dinner. Forks weren't commonly used in America until sometime in the 1800s. New colony stories are set in these early times and depict how a diverse group of critters lived and worked together to build a community in the wilderness. These stories also highlight how America has, from its beginning, benefited from the skills and talents of individuals from many different backgrounds and cultures. We sincerely hope these tales encourage you to rediscover America and develop a greater appreciation of our shared heritage. Welcome to the New World. The day begins. New Colony Village sat grandly on the upper banks of the Whipple River, overlooking an old, well-used watermill. As in many colonial-era communities, neat brick shops and homes were set in well-ordered rows, forming a wide thoroughfare through the town. This thoroughfare was aptly named Center Street, and it ended at a whitewashed, wood-framed meeting house with a tall bell tower. It was a delightful place, bounded on the north by thick woods of alder, birch, and white pine, and on the south by rolling farmland. The river, called the Poudre by the locals, flowed and curved around a good share of the village, and most families within its well-tended borders lived very comfortable, ordinary lives. Ordinary, that is, except that this was an early American critter colony, which most folks today would consider highly unusual. A long time ago, however, America was populated mostly by critters, and this colony was a hustling, bustling place, full of diverse creatures, each talented in their own way, and each responsible for contributing to the welfare of the close-knit community. Our story begins on an early autumn morning. Colorful, neatly painted wooden signs swung lazily above the doors of various village enterprises, and a light breeze heralded the arrival of another sunny but cool fall day. The woodlands to the north of the village were showing fall colors, and the crisp air was laden with a hint of apples and ripe pumpkins. The cobbled stones and neat walkways along Center Street were still empty except for the town's leading citizen, Mayor Turkey, who wandered here and there looking for someone to tip his hat to. A gold watch and chain, which he thought made him look even more official, swung lazily from the pocket of his neatly brushed coat. "Why, it's almost 7 a.m., he thought to himself as he checked the watch's worn face for the third time in the past 5 minutes. "I'm surprised no one else is up and about." The mayor shouldn't really have been surprised, since he typically went through the same routine every morning, and few of the town critters were usually up and about before 7 a.m. But finally, as the sun continued to rise above the green hills surrounding the village, other residents did begin to appear. A door creaked, and out from the jailhouse came Constable Cougar, who was heading over to Misty Skunk's bakery to sample any fresh pastries she might have made earlier that day. "And a good morning to you, Constable," said Mayor Turkey, tipping his hat with both a sense of importance and sense of relief, since he now had a good reason to be on the street and had someone to good morning to. "And to you, Mr. Mayor," Constable Cougar growled in return. He was somewhat out of sorts since he had fallen asleep at his desk in the jailhouse, and his coat still showed the marks left by the hard wooden back of his not-so-comfortable constable's chair. The constable then hurried his pace since he really had no desire to begin a discussion with anyone that early in the morning, and especially before he had his first bite of breakfast, and especially if that someone was the colony's very talkative mayor. Another door creaked, and out came Dolly Porcupine, heading for her tailor shop and hurrying in the cool morning air. More creaks were heard, and more critters continued to fill the street. Soon the clanging and banging of a hammer and anvil could be heard. The slow stamping of a printing machine followed, and before long, Miss Bunny was ringing the school bell, announcing to the world that lessons would begin very shortly. New Colony was awake. As part of the daily routine, it was the custom for any important announcements to be read each morning at 10 a.m. sharp from the steps of the meeting house. And it was also the custom for Mayor Turkey to do the reading. In the first place, he was a fairly good reader, for a turkey, and he also loved to be the center of attention. In other words, he was perfect for the job. And what a day this would be! For the good mayor had requested that the town printer, B. Franklin Badger, prepare a very special notice for him to read. It was not just any notice, the mayor thought as he busily declared good morning and tipped his hat to everyone who passed. It was the notice of notices, and notice they would, for he was going to disclose his brilliant idea for making New Colony a more interesting place to live and work. Down with tradition. Mayor Turkey had actually gotten the idea when, during one of his morning strolls, he had heard Misty Skunk explaining to Dolly Porcupine how to make critter scones, one of the favorites down at her bakery. In exchange, Dolly Porcupine indicated that she would show Miss Misty how to needlepoint and make some colorful hangings to brighten the walls of her bakery kitchen. That same day, he also overheard Doc Duck prescribe some medicine for one of Molly Possum's children, watched as Woodrow Beaver gnawed a new walking stick for B. Franklin Badger, and stopped by the meeting house, which also served as the village church, where he listened as old Pastor Tortoise practiced his upcoming Sunday sermon. The sermon's theme, which was titled "Do Unto Others," was really what led to the mayor's grand idea. In his message, Pastor Tortoise talked of the importance of treating others like you would want to be treated yourself. He described the many benefits of cooperation and how working together and supporting each other made their colony such an exceptional place to live. As Mayor Turkey quietly listened from a side door, he thought, do unto others. Why, that's what we do every day, except that we do for others. We bake, clean, grow, hammer, sew, wash, teach, build, plant, and so many other things in our little colony, and all are the better for it. Wouldn't it be marvelous? He said to himself as he quietly stepped away and continued his stroll. If we had a Do for Others Day, an entire day when each resident of our little colony switched tasks. The more he considered it, the more he liked the idea. A day of new experiences and new challenges. A day to bring the village closer together as everyone learned new skills and gained a greater appreciation of each other's talents, to include the mayor's talent for coming up with good ideas. Brilliant, 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 thought the mayor, referring to himself, of course. There was nothing left to do but decide on a date and how to determine who did what during this special day. Since it was such a good idea and he didn't want to share the credit, then the sooner the better, which of course was why he had asked B. Franklin Badger to place that special notice in the town crier. Sure enough, a few minutes before 10 o'clock, a crowd started gathering in front of the meeting house to hear the latest news. Standing on the front steps, the mayor checked his pocket watch one last time and began. Gobble, gobble, he loudly announced to get everyone's attention, and all other conversation stopped as he warmed to the task. My fellow critters, he paused as a serious look crossed his face. This is indeed a red-letter day for our community, an important day, and one that will be long remembered by one and all. Today, by proclamation, I declare to be Do for Others Day. He paused again to let the importance of what he was saying sink in. Ruffling his papers, he tried to look distinguished as he quickly continued. Which will actually begin tomorrow to give everyone a chance to prepare. So, Gobble, today I proclaim that, tomorrow, he intoned, raising an arm into the air, each of you will switch tasks for one full day so that you will better appreciate each other's contributions to our community, learn new skills, and enjoy taking a break from your usual labors. A hush fell over the crowd, who were both perplexed and unsure of what they had just heard. A Do for Others Day. Why, they each did for others every day already. Mistaking their silence as agreement rather than uncertainty, the mayor motioned for B. Franklin Badger to bring forward an old bucket that had been filled with folded sheets of paper, each containing the name of a task or skill typical of daily life in the little colony. With B. Franklin at his side, he then requested that each critter step forward and select one of the folded sheets. Don't look at them until all have picked and I have given the okay, he directed. Then we shall see what we shall see. Still somewhat confused and reluctant, the crowd did as asked. When the bucket was empty, the mayor instructed everyone to look at the paper that they had selected. Silence and surprise might best describe their reaction as they opened their individual sheets and looked within. The silence didn't last long, however, as very quickly grunts, growls, squeals, and squawks began as each realized what they were being asked to do. But, I was never good in class, muttered Constable Cougar, who had picked schoolmarm from the old bucket. Buford Bear, the colony's blacksmith, had much the same response to his task of becoming the village seamstress. The Buzzard brothers, Hiram and Jethro, went from being in charge of trash collection to operating the bakery. Their regular duties had been picked by Misty Skunk, who just stood in shocked surprise while absent-mindedly patting the town's new constable, Molly Possum, on her furry little head. Digby Gopher, who couldn't see very well under the best of circumstances, was taking over medical duties from Doc Duck, who, by chance, had also picked Digby's job as the colony's well digger. The assignments continued with Woodrow Beaver replacing Phineas Fox at the general store. Phineas then taking over Woodrow's woodshop, Willard Weasel becoming Pastor Weasel for the day, Dolly Porcupine moving over to Postmaster Owl's station, Pastor Tortoise relieving Molly Possum in the orchard, Otto Otter operating the printing press, Postmaster Owl becoming the town's woodcutter, and Miss Bunny supposedly learning how to shoe a horse and make iron implements. Even B. Franklin Badger was able to participate, since he had secretly picked his job from the bucket before bringing it into the crowd. I shall have a relaxing day and some nice fish for supper, he smiled inwardly, since he had given himself Otto Otter's job as village fisherman. Which just about completed the list, or at least it would have, except for a hand that was raised toward the back of the crowd. This hand, or rather paw, belonged to none other than George W. Raccoon, who, with his wife Martha, had been excluded from the drawing because they really didn't live within the village, but worked a neatly kept and very productive farm just outside of town. George had come to New Colony that morning for supplies, but had stopped to listen to the mayor's proclamation and then stayed to watch the reaction of the townfolk to their new duties. He had also noticed that Mayor Turkey had not picked a temporary duty for himself. Knowing the mayor to be a do-as-I-say and not necessarily as-I-do type of individual, and also noticing the look of satisfaction on the good mayor's face as he directed the activities of the other colony members, Farmer Raccoon quickly decided it was time for him to also participate in Mayor Turkey's program. "Mr. Mayor! Mr. Mayor!" George called loudly to get everyone's attention. "I believe, Your Honor, that there has been a grievous mistake." With a grin on his face, he walked to the steps of the meeting house and turned to face the crowd. A look of concern crossed the mayor's brow. "I have noticed, good mayor, that there apparently were not sufficient positions available for you to also be able to participate in this creative undertaking," Farmer Raccoon continued. "To remedy this situation, and since I have not picked from the old wooden bucket, I would propose that you trade places with me." Well, this had not been anticipated by Mayor Turkey, who felt that someone needed to be left in charge, and who better than him. But he did notice all eyes turn in his direction as the entire community awaited his response. He rubbed his chin and tried to think of an appropriate answer to the proposal that had been laid before him. "Well, my good fellow, I greatly appreciate your offer, but I wouldn't want to burden you with my extremely heavy workload and many responsibilities to our little village." "Nonsense!" exclaimed Farmer George. "You deserve a break just like everyone else, and since I'm the only other critter here who has not selected a new duty, I'm the logical choice for a trade. Please be at my farmhouse at 5 a.m. tomorrow morning, and my wife Martha will get you started." George winked at the crowd and continued, "I shall plan to be on Center Street bright and early to greet and encourage everyone as this special day begins." Mayor Turkey looked left and right, up and down. He hadn't been up by 5 a.m. for years, and maybe never. Suddenly, his do-for-others day didn't look quite as brilliant as before. But the eyes of New Colony were still upon him, and the silent stares he was receiving made it plain that he had best answer correctly. Very well then. Of course I shall participate and be glad to do so," he muttered half-heartedly, reasoning that, given his important position in the community, Martha Raccoon wouldn't make him do much actual work. With this reassuring thought in mind, the mayor regained his composure and recommended, in an official and important manner of course, that everyone visit their new places of business that very afternoon, and that they be prepared to operate that business by the next morning. The crowd dispersed, and George Raccoon turned one last time to the mayor. "No reason to come out today, Your Honor," George said merrily. "I'm sure Martha will give you plenty of direction tomorrow. See you then." And without even asking what responsibilities he would be undertaking as the colony's mayor for a day, George Raccoon headed back to his farm to do some special planning with Martha and prepare for their distinguished guest. The special day begins. For most residents of New Colony, the next morning dawned bright and sunny. For most, that is, except for Mayor Turkey, whose morning began much earlier and which found him in a dark mood that matched the still dark sky. True to his word, however, he approached the barnyard of the raccoon farm at 5 a.m. sharp. After receiving an uncertain greeting from some of the barnyard animals, he entered the front gate to the farmhouse and gave a loud rap on the weather-worn door. As if on cue, it swung open, and he was greeted by George Raccoon, who welcomed the mayor into a comfortable, warm parlor. "Martha!" George called out enthusiastically. "Come greet our special guest, or should I say, new hired hand. Ha!" Forcing a chuckle, as if he found the joke amusing, Mayor Turkey gazed past George at a particularly interesting table sitting next to the family kitchen. It was interesting because it was practically covered with food. Steaming pancakes, bowls of fruit, warm biscuits, and even a jar of what looked like Martha Raccoon's famous apple preserves. His anticipation was interrupted by George, who announced, "Well, I'd best be heading into town. Lots to do today, you know. Martha will get you started, Your Honor, and I sincerely hope that you enjoy the experience." Without another word, George Raccoon slipped through the door and literally skipped down the walk leading to the old iron gate that the mayor had entered just minutes earlier. Before Mayor Turkey could return his gaze to the well-stocked table, Martha Raccoon entered the room and offered her hand in greeting. Well, she wasn't actually offering her hand. She was offering a set of leather work gloves.
"Welcome,"
Martha said brightly.
"and I'm sure you'll have a productive day working at our little farm. Follow me, please."
And she stepped past the mayor and headed for the barn.
But,
the mayor stuttered as he looked first at the well-stocked table and then at the receding back of Mrs. Raccoon.
"Work first, eat later,"
she called back, as if reading his mind.
"First we'll take care of the animals, then we take care of the fields, and then, well, we shall see."
Reluctantly, Mayor Turkey turned and stepped back through the door as well, heading into a dim morning with the enticing image and smell of the wonderful-looking farm breakfast still fresh in his mind. Both changed quickly, however, as Martha led him back into the barnyard, and it became apparent that, at least for him, Do for Others Day had officially begun. Back in town. It didn't take Farmer Raccoon long to follow the well-traveled path leading back into New Colony. He thoroughly enjoyed walking past the well-kept fields, which were still illumined by soft light from the fading moon. This light cast equally soft shadows from rows of orderly haystacks, which left the impression of little, round houses stretching into the distance. The path also wound through Mrs. Possum's orchards, and he took a brief detour to grab a shiny, red apple from one of her many trees, which he would pay for, of course, and save for later, since he had already eaten a very large breakfast. The sun had just started to creep above the horizon when he entered the south end of Center Street and surveyed his new domain. All was quiet as night shadows continued to recede from the town's wide thoroughfare. Plump, orange pumpkins on doorsteps and other indications of the season slowly became visible, to include colorful fall wreaths hanging in frosty splendor on many of the residents' doors. With nothing else to do, George found a wooden chair in front of the general store and, leaning back against the wall, relaxed with an early morning nap. The town itself served as his alarm clock, as on the stroke of 7 a.m., doors started creaking and the noises of another busy day began. Soon he was wishing good morning to all who passed and tipping his hat from his comfortable wooden throne that still leaned lazily against the wall of the store. "This is great fun," he thought, as each greeting was respectfully returned and each critter headed to his or her new duties. Some seemed confused and had to retrace previously well-traveled routes to their usual places of business. Actually, few had bothered any type of orientation the previous day, so there was a feeling of uncertainty in the air. The street soon cleared, and by mid-morning the colony's new mayor was becoming very bored. George Raccoon was used to putting in a full day's work by the time most critters were getting ready for lunch. So far, however, he had only accomplished a brief nap and finished the apple he had picked from Molly Possum's orchard. True, he had enjoyed greeting the various residents of the little village, most of whom he very much liked. But the street had seemingly become as empty as his schedule for the day. He missed his animals, the earthy smell of his fields, and the feeling of satisfaction he always got when a task was completed. He closed his eyes and tried to think of something productive to do. "This is going to be a very long day," he said to himself as he wondered how things were going back at the farm. Back at the farm. And how were things at the farm? Well, I'll tell you. Mayor Turkey had dutifully followed Martha Raccoon through the front gate, expecting a brief orientation and some light work before stopping to enjoy breakfast. Their first destination had been the barn, where Martha picked up a shovel and rake and handed them to the mayor.
"Your Honor,"
she said with a slight bow,
"as your first task, please clean out the stalls and put in fresh hay."
Without another word, Martha turned and headed back to the farmhouse. The mayor stood in silence for a moment, taking in the smell of the barn and the task that lay ahead.
"Well,"
he reasoned,
"the sooner I start, the sooner I finish and get breakfast."
And start he did. The first stall hadn't been too bad. It was smaller and was used for a few farm goats. As he progressed down the line of stalls, however, the animals, and the cleanup job, became much bigger.
"Shovel and rake, place in the wagon and don't take a break,"
he hummed to himself as he tried to take his mind off the hay and dust that slowly covered his fine clothes. His arms and legs were also becoming very tired, and he thought he would never reach that last stall. Finally, the job was completed, and Mayor Turkey stood back to review his work. It was with an unusual sense of satisfaction that he had turned at the approach of Martha Raccoon, ceremoniously handed her the tools she had previously given to him, and said,
Well, I would think that covers my duties for the day, and I'm sure that breakfast has now become lunch, or possibly even dinner. Shall we have some?" "Lunch?" exclaimed Martha with a quick laugh. "Why, Mayor, it's not even mid-morning, and our work has just begun."
She handed him a cold biscuit, a tin cup of water, and continued,
"Come with me, please, and I'll show you the next task."
Leading him from the barn, she strolled past the pig pen, which greatly relieved the mayor since he had no desire to clean that out as well, and into a wide open field. Standing beside the field was a large farm horse attached to what Mayor Turkey recognized as a plow.
"We harvested this field a few weeks ago,"
Martha explained as they looked over the brown rows of broken corn stalks.
"We now need to plow the stalks and stumps under to prepare the field for winter."
The mayor munched on his cold biscuit as both he and the horse looked at each other with suspicion.
Gobble. Well, yes, I've never plowed a field before. How is it done?" "It's quite simple,"
Martha explained.
"You just wrap the reins around the plow handle like this, yell, 'Giddy-ap, Blue!' and push as Old Blue pulls the plow through the field. Oh, and be careful where you walk. It hurts if you step on the stub of a cornstalk."
Mayor Turkey gingerly stepped up to the plow and grabbed both handles. Before he could say, "Giddy-ap, Blue," Old Blue giddy-apped on his own. Off the pair went through the field, and not necessarily in a very straight line. Within minutes, it became clear that there would be no humming, whistling, stopping, or resting on this job, which he had done quite a bit on his previous assignment. This was going to be even harder work than cleaning out the barn. The mayor's already soiled clothes now lost any remaining resemblance to their original color or fabric as clouds of dust moved up his legs, covered his fine coat, and even lodged in his throat. It became difficult to see, and his stumbling feet frequently encountered one of the sharp stubs that he had been warned to avoid. His legs and wings soon ached, and by the beginning of the second row, the good mayor was being literally dragged around the field by the seemingly tireless horse.
"What have I done?"
he wondered aloud.
"What have I done, and what's happening in my village?"
Meanwhile, back at New Colony. There was actually a good deal of activity back at the village, and not all of it productive. It didn't take long for George to conclude that the mayor's job had to be more than just sitting around and tipping his hat all day, so he decided to visit the various places of business and see how everyone was doing. Some of his visits were shorter than others. He had opened the door to the bakery and then quickly closed it without going inside, where flour filled the air and appeared to cover everything from floor to ceiling. Waving at the Buzzard brothers through the front window and dusting off his shirt and pants, he proceeded next to the schoolhouse. He liked to hear the laughter of children, and he found the playground full, as apparently all were enjoying recess. George did notice, however, that there didn't seem to be much supervision around, so he peered through the school window and saw Constable Cougar, the new schoolmarm, neatly tied up and sitting in the corner, wearing a dunce cap. Not wanting to embarrass the good constable, George quietly turned and walked away. "I believe I shall leave our sheriff to handle his young charges to the best of his ability. He certainly needs no help from me." It was much the same story at the other businesses he visited, and toward the end of the day, life in the little colony appeared somewhat different than it had just that morning. For example, Miss Misty's horse had needed shoeing, but it now stood hitched at the rail in front of the general store sporting 4 new pink slippers, which were much easier for Miss Bunny to make than horseshoes. She thought that the lace around the top of each slipper was a nice touch. Over at the bakery, the Buzzard brothers, not so fresh, bread loaves had come out of the oven as hard as rocks. After trying to nibble one just to be polite, Mayor Raccoon had recommended they be used to replace some of the broken cobblestones on Center Street. Molly Possum had not arrested anyone all day, which actually wasn't that unusual in New Colony. But she had made some beautiful, bright curtains for the jailhouse window.
"Oh,
Doc Duck had started digging a new well for Postmaster Owl, but he had quickly tired of the task, diagnosed himself as needing bed rest, and spent the day napping. Buford Bear did manage to work on some trousers that Phineas Fox had dropped off, which had a hole in one pocket. When Phineas picked them up later that day, he found that there were now 2 holes, and that one trouser leg had been sewn shut, and poorly at that. Buford had also attempted his own version of ironing, which explained the hammer marks up and down their still wrinkled legs. Speaking of hammering, Phineas Fox had struck his thumbs and fingers numerous times trying to make a bookcase in Woodrow Beaver's woodshop. And Doc Gopher's poor eyesight had resulted in bandages being placed about everywhere but the affected areas. Woodrow Beaver had actually done a fairly good job in running the general store, except now there were tooth marks on the long wooden counter and also on a good share of the merchandise. Woodrow tended to gnaw on things when he was nervous. From morning to the afternoon, it was much the same at the other businesses visited by George Raccoon. So, toward the end of the colony's first official Do for Others Day, no apples had been picked. Pastor Tortoise couldn't reach them. No edible bread or scones baked, no clothes made or repaired, no horses shod, no wells dug, no papers printed, no wood worked, no trash collected. Everything smelled just fine to Misty Skunk. No real medical attention given, no mail delivered. The letters kept getting stuck on Dolly Porcupine's quills. No sermons prepared, only one fish caught, and a very small one at that. And Mayor Raccoon had to send Miss Misty over to the school to untie Constable Cougar. Oh, and absolutely nothing had been learned in the classroom by the children of New Colony, except maybe how to tie knots. It appeared that Do for Others Day had become Do Nothing for Others Day, because very little work had actually been accomplished in trying to carry out Mayor Turkey's grand idea. Taking one last walk down Center Street, George decided that it was time to call a halt before someone got hurt, equipment was damaged, or a customer actually tried to eat one of Hiram and Jethro's scones, which were almost as hard as their bread. Directing Willard Weasel to pull the bell rope and summon the town, Mayor George headed for the meeting house steps. Sure enough, within just minutes it seemed like the entire colony had stopped what they were doing, or not doing, and were also standing before the steps, waiting expectantly for what their acting mayor had to say.
Well, dear friends, George began, as Mayor Turkey indicated in his proclamation, this will be a day long remembered in the colony. Happily, it appears you have all survived the experience, he continued, and I hope you learned something in the process.
Grumblings of assent ran through the crowd, and Buford Bear stepped forward and announced,
I can say that I have a new appreciation for the good work done for all of us by Dolly Porcupine. If I never see a needle and thread the rest of my born days, it will be too soon.
Several in the crowd chuckled, and the chuckles then turned into actual laughter as Dolly also stepped forward, her quill still covered in postal letters.
Well, I can certainly say the same thing about Postmaster Owl,
she grinned, shaking her back and trying to catch any letters that came loose.
And the same for Miss Buddy,
yelled Constable Cougar.
and Doc Duck, and Phineas Fox, and Miss Misty,
shouted others. Everyone was being mentioned, and soon the critters were patting each other on the back, relating stories of their day, and expressing their great appreciation for the skills and hard work of their fellow colony members.
Don't tell me Mayor Turkey's special day may have actually done some good after all,
wondered George Raccoon aloud. And it appeared that it had, for over time, the residents of New Colony had begun to take each other for granted. They assumed that their children would always be well educated, the streets of their little village would always be clean and safe, and there would always be others around to grow the food, bake the bread, and ensure the shelves over at the general store were well stocked. The Do for Others Day had let each critter experience, for just a short while, how their lives might be different if they couldn't depend on the services being provided by others. It had also made them more aware of the important part they each played in the success of the colony. As these thoughts crossed his mind, George saw movement at the other end of Center Street. He raised his arms for silence and pointed toward a dusty, dirty, bedraggled, and obviously exhausted critter, slowly limping into town. Everyone turned to look, and someone said,
Why, I think that's Mayor Turkey.
Another said, Couldn't be.
He's too thin.
Of course, it was Mayor Turkey. And thinner he was, and exhausted he was, and sore he was. In fact, he was about everything but happy that he had ever thought about proclaiming a Do for Others Day. His final hours at the farm had been the hardest he had ever worked in his life. Old Blue seemed to have a mind of his own. When the mayor yelled, "Stop!" or "Giddy up!" Blue would do the opposite. If Mayor Turkey pulled on the right rein, Blue would turn left. On the left rein, Blue would turn right. Before long, the mayor's knobby knees were moving almost as much dirt as the plow as Blue dragged him from row to row. But it didn't stop there. Martha Raccoon had finally pulled him from the field and put him to work repairing fences, painting the barn door, mending harnesses, and completing some other chores that she had written on her to-do list. When he was finally invited to rest and have some of her exceptional cooking, the poor mayor was too tired to enjoy it. He did take a seat at the farmhouse table, but after one bite, his head had sunk slowly into the mashed potatoes and gravy covering his plate, and he had fallen fast asleep. It was a much more sympathetic Martha that had helped him up from the table and sent him back to the village, and now here he was, slowly approaching the crowd, his head, with some gravy stains still visible, slightly bowed and ready to accept the criticism that he knew would surely come. His special day had not turned out anything like he had planned, and Mayor Turkey was prepared to have it get even worse. First there was silence as the townspeople stared at the forlorn figure standing before them. Then it began, quietly at first, but rapidly increasing in volume. Was it clapping he heard? Were they celebrating his obvious distress? Or were they just happy that his self-proclaimed Do for Others Day was finally over? And then the cheering started, and also rose in crescendo. Clapping and cheering, cheering and clapping, Mayor Turkey was hoisted into the air and carried on furry shoulders to the steps of the meeting house. "Huzzah!" the crowd yelled in unison. "Huzzah for our good mayor and his good idea!" For once in his life, the colony's honorable mayor was absolutely speechless. He had earlier determined, sometime between feeding the chickens and milking the cows, that his idea had actually not been very good at all. In fact, if other members of the colony had as much trouble performing their new tasks as he had experienced, the day should have been a disaster. And yet, here he was, like a returning hero, being carried on the shoulders of two of his village friends and being cheered as well. From his high perch, a tear touched his beak as he gazed down at the crowd in wonder. He was gently lowered beside George Raccoon, who asked Buford Bear to hold the mayor up just a few more minutes so he could receive the recognition he deserved and, given his apparent condition, hopefully not fall asleep. "Mayor Turkey and friends!" George tried to sound and look official during his last official act. "My good mayor and friends," he repeated, "this has truly been a wondrous day. I have watched each of you try, to the best of his or her ability, to do something for the benefit of others and our community. I have also watched many of you fail in your efforts, some of which," George added, "were very entertaining." Constable Cougar stared down at his feet, and several others looked very sheepish. "But you tried, and tried very hard. You are to be commended, and I know that we all now have a greater appreciation for the contributions of everyone who lives in our little village. This, I am sure, was our mayor's intent," George continued, "to make each of us more aware that the strength of our colony lies in the diversity and skills of our fellow critters." Everyone cheered again as Mayor Turkey's head bobbed up and down, more in exhaustion than agreement, but he did manage a small smile, which, as was mentioned before, is difficult for a turkey. "And as my last official act, I would also like to make a proclamation." Mimicking the motions of Mayor Turkey from the day before, George raised his arms and intoned, "I, temporary Mayor George Raccoon, do hereby declare that this date, every year, be celebrated as a day of rest and recreation. A day of games, contests, picnics, and visits to each other's homes. Furthermore, that during this special day, the Buzzard Brothers be allowed nowhere near the bakery, Miss Bunny's students be allowed nowhere near Constable Cougar, and Buford Bear be discouraged from trying to repair any trousers or other articles of clothing. Ever again." The cheers once again turned to laughter, and even Constable Cougar, who really did love the children of New Colony, had to smile. Do for Others Day was unanimously renamed Do Nothing Day. And every year on that date, that's exactly what they did. Epilogue. While life in New Colony slowly returned to normal after a great deal of repair and cleaning, there were a number of changes also apparent in the village. For example, the Buzzard brothers proudly shared their recipe for cobblestone bread with the village baker, Misty Skunk, who periodically mixed up a few batches to help with street repairs. Miss Bunny's horsey slippers, as she called them, became very popular, and no respectable family would be without at least one set. The curtains Molly Possum had made for the windows at the jailhouse also started a trend, and she was kept busy for a long time fitting all the other windows in town with colorful fabric. And the mayor, well, he had also learned some very valuable lessons. He could still be found on Center Street at sunrise looking for someone to greet, but his responsibilities didn't stop there. He began visiting the shops and other businesses within New Colony regularly to see if there was some assistance he might provide. On any given day, he might be found stocking shelves at the general store, helping to supervise the school playground, or hauling bags of flour to the bakery. And the good mayor would also periodically visit George and Martha's farm to bring a few apples to Old Blue and sample some of Martha's cooking, after helping with the chores, of course. His motto became, "Well done is better than well said." And he began including this advice every time he tipped his hat and said, "Good morning," to a friend or neighbor. And as his workday became longer and his speeches became shorter, he found that he had never been more respected, productive, or happier in his entire life. Finally, as envisioned by George Raccoon, Do Nothing Day did become an annual village celebration, with the highlight being the traditional tying up of Constable Cougar by the children of the little community, with the constable's blessing and all in good fun. Not much work got done on this special holiday, but not much work had gotten done on the original day either, so it all worked out in the end. Which is where we are now. The end. Look for new adventures of the Colony Critters in upcoming publications. We hope you have enjoyed this presentation of Rediscover America's The Do for Others Day by Roger Hukle and Elizabeth Hillie, with illustrations by Bob Haynes. Read by Mark Epperson and co-produced with Suzanne Ahrens of Crystal Peak Design. Copyright 2014 by New Colonies Media One, LLC. All rights reserved. All rights reserved. All rights reserved. We hope you have enjoyed this presentation of Rediscover America's The Do for Others Day by Roger Hukle and Elizabeth Hillie, with illustrations by Bob Haynes. Read and produced by Mark Epperson. Copyright 2014 by New Colonies Media 1, LLC. All rights reserved.